So let's kick it off. The title of my talk is Decision Landscapes and Algorithmic Fairness. I've been thinking a lot recently about decision-making in complex situations. And it seems to me that when people think about making decisions, obviously one dimension of that is they're interested in making good decisions. They're interested in optimizing for decision quality. But that's often not the only thing that is going on. So those of you who are familiar with British TV, probably not many, will recognize the three characters here on your screen. This is a screen cap from the British show Yes Minister. And there was a really interesting dialogue that actually went viral during the coronavirus pandemic because it was illustrative of a common problem in decision making. So the dialogue goes as follows. In stage one, we say nothing is going to happen. Well, in stage two, we say something may be about to happen, but we should do nothing about it. Stage three, we say that maybe we should do something about it, but there's nothing we can do. And finally, in stage four, we say maybe there was something we could have done, but it's too late now. So I think this is illustrative of a common phenomenon. These three people having this conversation clearly have an agenda for how this decision is supposed to pan out. They have a kind of ultimate goal in mind, and in this case, it's maximal inaptitude. They don't want to make any decisions about this particular decision problem that they're dealing with. And so their strategy is to artificially alter the decision landscape in order to make it seem like there isn't actually an ability to choose in this scenario. So I want to explain and explore what these artificially restricted decision landscapes might mean for how we can think about algorithmic fairness. The claims that I'd like to make in particular are first, of course, much of the existing literature, both in computer science and in emerging discussions on AI ethics and moral and political philosophy, have been really focused on optimizing decision quality. For good reason, right? Optimizing decision quality is a really important problem, particularly because we have so much empirical evidence that there is a huge potential for algorithmic decision-making to further entrench structures of gender and racial inequality, as well as other inequalities in society. So I want to say that that's a really good perspective to have, but it's going to be insufficient if what we ultimately care about is fairness or justice. So in particular, I think we really have to take seriously the task of critically scrutinizing available decision landscapes, both in terms of alternative decision problems that we could solve algorithmically and decisions that we could solve just via social and political and institutional transformation. So which alternative decision outcomes are available to us in a given problem space, and also which alternative problems could we decide to solve instead? And ultimately, I think that kind of question, that question about the decision landscape, is going to have really important implications for how we should think about very applied questions that have been generating a lot of public discussion recently. So think about the deployability question in relation to facial recognition tools used in policing and immigration enforcement. A lot of the questions that people ask about those tools is not only how do we get them to be more accurate, it's also, should we deploy them at all, right? Is that the right tool to use for this particular problem? And so the intuition that I want to motivate today is, well, if optimizing for decision quality for a given problem, let's call it P1, actually moves us further away from justice, we should just solve a different problem instead, right? So this is going to be an important part of thinking about what algorithmic fairness requires. So I'll begin by sketching a little bit how our decisions about design and deployment are inherently normatively tainted, normatively laden, as philosophers often say. And I will use that to motivate the question of why decision landscapes are so important by making three interconnected arguments. The first one is called the benchmarking argument, and I'll continue with what I call the A-leaves argument and the so-called quality independence argument. So it's now become common to say that designing algorithmic systems means making explicit and implicit choices that have immense ethical and political significance. So in terms of design, we can think about things like unstated assumptions, so the way in which I define my decision task in the first place without questioning, what else I could do. But also just which concepts I choose to operationalize in my system. So thinking, for instance, about something like a credit-worthy individual or a high-risk defendant, those are inherently contested concepts in the sense that there isn't a straightforward and universally agreed upon definition of how best to cash out what it means to fall into that category. So there is an immediate moral and political way to defining and restricting concepts in certain ways in order to operationalize them. Similarly, when it comes to collecting and labeling data or adjusting decision rules that we've adopted over time, and just thinking about how to abstract and idealize within our models. So which features do we want to make our system blind to? Which features do we pick out as particularly relevant? All of those are choices that aren't inherently neutral in some way. They're going to have political and moral implications. And so we can see that this trickles down through our entire machine learning loop. So even just defining the decision problem itself is morally laden in those ways. But each subsequent decision-making juncture in our design process will have this moral and political baggage as well. The same is true for deployment decisions, though. So the problem doesn't stop there. So making decisions about where to deploy, when to deploy, and who to involve in the decision to deploy, right? So do we let private corporations make that decision? Do we let democratically authorized public officials make that decision? Does the democratic constituency as such decide about this? Within that democratic constituency, do we maybe prioritize the people who are most directly affected by the use of such tools or not? All of those, again, are decisions that I think very clearly have a moral and political baggage attached to them. So applying this more concretely to the problem of algorithmic fairness specifically, we might wonder, why does it matter so much that we define that decision problem in the right way? Right? Because if we look at the current debate on this, we often see two sets of questions. The first set of questions is just kind of conceptual, right? So what's the nature and scope of the problem? How big of a moral and political problem is it in comparison to other important problems that we could solve, such as transparency, accountability, privacy, plug in whatever other important normative goal you like. And secondly, we might be asking about the solution. So how should we solve algorithmic unfairness, either by creating ex post accountability mechanisms, auditing, impact assessments, or how should we prevent it going forward by implementing certain plausible fairness metrics, for instance, which obviously are often hard to reconcile with each other, but that would be part of a plausible ex ante approach to this kind of issue. Now, I think we just can't do the latter if we don't have a clear picture of the former, right? So in thinking about solutions and evaluating them and ranking them with respect to their plausibility vis-a-vis each other, we're going to have a plausible picture of what type of problem we're dealing with in the first place, right? So we're going to want a clear picture of what our success conditions are in order to determine, well, when have we actually solved the problem of algorithmic unfairness? And so here we can clearly see that technological considerations will always be interacting with the normative considerations, both ethical and political, right? So if models always dynamically interact with the world, and there's going to be feedback effects from individuals and groups who are subject to algorithmic assessments that then get fed back into the model, that kind of dynamic is just ineradicable. So in order to address that first kind of question, the nature and scope of the problem, I don't think we can focus exclusively on the technological considerations, but we also can't focus exclusively on the normative ones. So this kind of ineradicable model-world interaction is going to be really important for scrutinizing our decision landscape here. But so if all of these kinds of questions don't operate in an ethical and political vacuum, the question is, how do we actually respond to that, right? So if we think about our responsibilities here, I think one intuitive grounding for that responsibility is, well, if we can make choices in design and deployment, that's why we're on the hook here. Right? So the ability to choose implies a set of moral duties, and that might include a duty to make really good decisions and maybe some other duties, which we will talk about later. So by that, I mean not only developers and researchers, by the way. Obviously, those who are directly involved in design and deployment decisions might have particular obligations, but I think actually the scope of duty holders might be much more expansive here. Once it becomes common knowledge that certain forms of decision-making can entrench certain inequalities that are actually contrary to democratic values. So I think living up to this ethical and political responsibility here will require, amongst other things, just a kind of public justification of what we're trying to achieve here. So instead of simply saying, we made a good decision here because we optimized for, some set of values that we care about, I think we also have a duty to justify, well, what was the goal of using AI or machine learning for this given decision task in the first place? Was it because we thought we could increase impartiality or accuracy? Was it because we just wanted to be maximally efficient and save resources? That's going to be something that is going to be important to publicly articulate in our mode of justification. And that's going to also entail telling a story about how far we have fallen short of important normative goals, right? So what was our ideal baseline and how much have we failed to approximate that fully by using a given machine learning tool in a given domain. So I think now we can distinguish between two kinds of concerns for algorithmic fairness research, both in philosophy and computer science. So thinking back to our machine learning loop from before, all of the design and deployment issues that we discussed before, I think can be viewed or framed as something that can be optimized, right? So where we can optimize decision quality. And the decision problem itself is something that can be reconsidered. So I think that second dimension is just heavily under-theorized so far, especially in this emerging debate in philosophy. And that's kind of a shame because I think that's actually important and useful for thinking more fully about what our moral duties are in this context. So let's consider 3 reasons why this matters. The first one I call the benchmarking argument because it often surfaces in public debate about benchmarking. So hold in your mind a very common case that is often cited in FedML discussions, the seminal 2016 ProPublica study about the COMPAS algorithm, which was a tool provided by Northpoint Incorporated to score individuals with respect to their risk of criminal recidivism. And so what ProPublica found was that there were significant racial disparities in terms of the distribution of error. So the tool failed differently for Black defendants, thereby entrenching existing injustices in the criminal justice system further. And so people might respond to that kind of finding, and in fact they often do, by saying, well, it's true that there were disparities of that kind in the algorithm, but ultimately human judges are also deeply flawed and biased and obviously informed by the very same structures of social inequality. So if you can marginally improve on that by using an algorithmic tool, then obviously we should deploy that tool, right? So that kind of view is then often articulated as a response to a non-deployment argument. When people say, don't deploy COMPAS in the world given the disparate distribution of error rates, the response often is, well, if we're benchmarking on humans, it's not plausible to not prefer algorithmic decision-making here. Now, that seems really plausible if our only decision space is just making this one decision about predicting recidivism risk in an effort to optimize for some plausible value ends, such as adhering to due process, ensuring procedural fairness, or approximating impartiality in our public institutions. So all of those are public and democratic goals that are relatively broadly accepted. And holding that kind of set of values fixed for now, we can see that actually, if that's our normative goal, there's many other problems we could be solving in our pursuit of that. And many of those problems could be solved in conjunction with each other. So one way of thinking about this, I think, is, well, if what we want is, greater justice in the criminal justice process, greater impartiality, perhaps, greater fairness over time, then thinking about how we can adopt rehabilitative approaches or change mandatory minimum sentencing laws might be just as important as predicting recidivism risk. So it's not obvious that there is a kind of predetermined ranking of important problems. that we necessarily have to solve via the use of algorithmic tools. So holding in our minds that actually the available decision landscape is much wider than just the task of predicting recidivism risk reveals that the picture that we see on the left actually is operating with a quite limited decision landscape. So it's not often clear that we need algorithmic tools for particular tasks, such as P1, but it's also often not clear whether we should be solving P1 in the first place. And I think anybody who insists that actually solving P1, so predicting recidivism risk, is in fact the only problem that we should be solving, is already making another one of those judgments that have normative baggage, much like design and deployment decisions have their inherent normative baggage. So I think this can happen even if somebody knows that actually we could be solving other decision problems instead. So somebody could be well aware that instead of algorithmically predicting recidivism risk, we could instead try to change legal and social structures. They might be aware of the possibility, but they might just think, well, it's actually not feasible to solve those other bigger problems right now, which is why we have to solve this algorithmic prediction task instead. And that's why we should deploy algorithmic decision-making tools for this purpose. Philosophers have termed these kinds of argumentative structures cryptonormative judgments. So here I'm following a recent paper by Alex Worsnip. Worsnip gives a good example of this. So he says, if somebody says it's not that I think phying, so for instance, solving a given problem, isn't the right thing to do, it's just that I think it's not possible in these circumstances. That's a classic example of a cryptonormative judgment, right? So there's already kind of a story in the background of how we should respond to something like a feasibility constraint. So if something seems hard or even impossible to do, it's not worth aspiring to that goal. So turning now to a related problem that I think kind of flows neatly from this issue is what I call the A-leaves argument. Philosophers have talked about A-leaves as the kinds of belief-like mental states that can move us to action, even if they actually conflict with what we believe in explicitly. So Tamar Gendler has developed a well-known defense of this view. So I think the danger here is that occasionally when we make decisions by using algorithmic decision-making tools and we optimize them over time, the danger might be that we might be making misguided assessments about what it means to have solved a given problem. And so what I'm worried about here in this context is a kind of spillover effect. Holding our case from before in mind again, so the Compass case that ProPublica discussed, this is how I think it can play out. So A might believe that she's just doing one thing. A might believe that she's just solving the problem of predicting recidivism risk in order to approximate some form of procedural justice. But actually, A might also form certain A-leaves about what it means that she's doing that. So A might think, well, given that I now know that certain individuals are high risk, what else might they do in society? So there's a stigmatizing danger here of making certain assessments, especially if those assessments look like they're made in a quite impartial way. So I think for us, in combination with the benchmarking argument, that grounds an immediate presumption in favor of critically scrutinizing, well, why did we select that problem to solve, and what does it mean when we have solved that problem? But finally, I think there's an even more concerning reason why decision landscapes matter so much and why we should pay more attention to them. I think that occasionally our duty to optimize decisions that we make might actually directly conflict with our duty to scrutinize decision landscapes. So assume that we buy into the general view that our ability to make design and deployment decisions grounds a duty to optimize decision quality. And assume further that you also buy into the view that that ability to choose equally justifies why we have a duty to scrutinize decision landscapes critically. Well, what do we do when people have really strange preferences and views about scrutinizing decision landscapes? one common phenomenon is the issue of status quo bias, right? So we know empirically that people greatly prefer the decision landscape that they can foresee, that they currently have. People often perceive alterations to that decision landscape as a loss no matter what. And this has really important implications for how people are likely to define the normative goals that they think are worth aspiring to, or the goals that we ought to pursue as a society. So I think there's a danger that we might err on the side of articulating less ambitious, more local, more feasible goals, following a kind of logic like, let's fix what we can right now, in the hopes that that will actually ultimately move us further or closer to justice. So that might take the form of saying, we know that our technology interacts dynamically with the world. We know that it will be, to some extent, reflecting and exacerbating social injustices. But at the same time, we can make local improvements here, so we can improve predictive parity across different social demographic groups, for instance. And so if we can do that, we should, right? So we should improve what we can. And so the danger here is that optimizing for decision quality in that way might in some scenarios move us closer, further away from justice, especially in cases in which we actually have significant uncertainty about the nature of the feasibility constraints that we're dealing with. So those of you in the room who are political philosophers will know that there is significant philosophical debate on the nature of feasibility constraints and the question of whether we should change our normative ideals in response to things like, this ideal is impossible for me to achieve right now, or it's going to be costly for me to achieve this ideal. Should I maybe articulate less ambitious goals in circumstances in which empirical constraints just make it difficult to optimize entirely? Now, just to see how this might affect our decision-making structure, think about, again, a given decision problem, P1. So it could be something like predicting recidivism risk, or it could be something else. And holding that decision-making problem constant, I might foresee a whole set of possible normative goals that I might aspire to, right? So there might be some fairly local goals, some pretty small goals that are maybe not fully optimal, but they look pretty attractive, something like N1. I'm also going to see, there's going to be some goals that are just clearly just impossible, conceptually impossible, logically impossible, and they're going to stay impossible over time, for instance, because there's major computational complexity involved or things like that, or there's just a kind of mathematical inconsistency about reconciling multiple fairness metrics with each other. So that would be something like N5 over here. There might be some normative goals where I'm not quite sure about how feasible they are, and maybe they're feasible right now, but they might become feasible over time, something like N4. And I'm also going to know that there's going to be some really uncontroversially important things that we can achieve that would be really, really good and worth aspiring to. And they look like they're feasible if we try. They're going to be feasible over time. So what I have in mind here is something like N3. So let's say some plausible conception of distributive justice or relational equality, some slogan like let's treat people as equals in the context of our public institutions, for instance. So that would be something that we can articulate in ways that are perhaps difficult to implement. So they're going to be subject to soft feasibility constraints, but they're going to look plausible, and they would be a big get for us if we could actually sufficiently approximate them. But thinking about our decision-making problem, P1 here, I might think, well, at first, let me just get that small goal, right? Like that local improvement that I can make, P1. And I think there's just going to be situations in which doing that will make it much, much harder, or in fact impossible, to actually achieve that important goal N3 fully. Whereas if I had taken a less optimal and more difficult decision at first, so not actually optimizing in my first decision step and going for something like normative goal N2, then it might still become possible for me to achieve something like that big goal N3. And so, of course, if I had redefined my decision problem in the first place, that decision space could have looked very different. So my successive optimization for decision quality may have been stacked really differently had I started from a different problem space. Now, again, our intuition, or at least my intuition for these kinds of cases, is that if optimizing for decision quality in a given problem one moves us further away from justice, we should in fact try to solve a different problem instead. So just to give you one example for the kinds of cases that I have in mind here, I'm thinking about recent efforts to use facial recognition technology to infer particular behavioral characteristics purely from facial data. This was shocking to many people simply because the researchers involved were attempting to infer directly from facial data to things like sexual orientation or future criminal behavior. And so the parallels to historical forms of racist pseudoscience like phrenology were clear to many people. And so there's at least an expressivist harm in using these kinds of tools to use inferences from a particular type of relatively superficial data to very deep predictions about future behavior or preferences or personal identity. And so I think that is exactly the kind of case where we have a strong presumption to critically think about whether we should be using that kind of tool to solve that kind of problem in the first place. In addition, and this is a distinct concern, I think if our path towards a given plausible normative goal would require distributing the burdens of optimization, so the burdens of meeting our duty to optimize for decision quality in some plausible way, if we distribute that in a disproportionate way, and especially in a way that further exacerbates injustice in society, that counts as a distinct reason not to deploy at that moment in time. So consider, for instance, this recent case where Google used a subcontracted firm to improve their facial recognition tools. So there was a lot of empirical evidence that those tools, again, exhibited racial bias or further entrenched racial disparities. And so obviously one way of addressing that would be to gather more data for faces with dark skin tones. And so what the subcontracted firm did was they tried to contact homeless people, and especially people of color, and offered them $5 gift cards to take videos of their faces. To make matters worse, they actually deceived the people that they spoke to by saying that this was a survey or a selfie game. So there were many moral and political problems with this. To me, perhaps the biggest one is that there was an initial issue of injustice here, so the racial disparate impact. And then the burden of optimizing was again distributed in a way that further disadvantaged the people who were disadvantaged in the first place by this. So I think that counts as a distinctive reason to be skeptical of solving that kind of decision problem. So for instance, using facial recognition tools in policing with the current technology that we have in this kind of domain, given that the effects of optimization and the effects of approximating or trying to approximate a plausible normative goal are in fact further entrenching injustice. And so if justice is ultimately what we care about, then I think we should be holding that fixed and not the decision landscape that we're currently dealing with. So moving towards justice shouldn't further entrench injustice here. Now, of course, I think we need to be really careful to make domain-specific judgments here. I don't think that there is going to be a plausible general theory of non-deployment. I think for each domain and each tool, we have to ask, well, how does it actually interact with our decision-making structure and our structure of plausible normative values, including but maybe not limited to justice? And I think that will require thinking about this critically early and often. So early on in the design stages and early on in deployment decisions, and to then iteratively think about whether actually our initial decision has moved us further away from a goal or has pushed us closer towards it. That might also mean putting these kinds of issues on democratic decision-making agendas. I believe the specifics on how to do that for another talk, but I think one clear upshot for political philosophy here is that if we buy into the argument about decision landscapes, it's going to be really important to view this as the kind of problem that should be governed collectively. So the upshot is, if choices concerning design and deployment are choices of ethical and political significance, including choices about how to deal with uncertainty, about how to change our goals over time, how to articulate our success conditions for things like algorithmic fairness, then scrutinizing decision landscapes is equally as important and maybe even more important than thinking about optimizing for decision quality. If optimizing for decision quality in a given problem space in a given domain, P1, moves us further away from justice or some other important political goal or ethical goal, then we should solve a different problem, call it P2 instead. Okay, thank you.